Today's speaker, Edward Chow, is a 2017 Cleveland Visiting Professor. Cleveland Visiting Professorship that is a highly competitive honor granted only to the outstanding Ohio alumni. So that's pretty outstanding. When Professor Chow has a BA in economics and MA in international studies in the late 1960s, you said?
Half a century ago.
Yeah. Okay. And he's also a senior fellow in the Center for Strategic and International Studies, headquartered in DC. And he's an international energy expert with 40 years of experience in the oil and energy sector. Indeed, he worked for oil company Chevron for 20 years. Professor Chow has advised numerous governments around the world and international financial institutions, major oil companies, including those operating in Central Asia, Russia, and Eurasia. That's what he's going to talk about today. And without further ado, I will let you hear from Professor Chow.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. I've got a bit of a stiff back today. I'm not sure why. Must be that lovely bed that they give you at Bromley Hall to sleep on. But it's a real pleasure to be addressing the wealth and poverty theme here at the college. I did go to school here, started here almost exactly 50 years ago. And it's kind of interesting to be in Alden Library, which was a brand new building when I was here. Probably didn't spend enough time here. So I'm glad to be making up part of that time by speaking to all of you. I'm going to draw mainly from my own personal experience and my own thoughts and conclusions from having worked in this area ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're going to talk about Eurasia, and by that I'm mainly referring to the oil and gas countries in the former Soviet Union. I never got a chance to visit the Soviet Union. It collapsed before I had a chance to visit it. So this is really mainly drawn from the post-Soviet period in which I was quite intimately involved, both as someone who worked for Chevron. Chevron was one of the first countries to enter into a major oil and gas investment in the former Soviet Union, and later on as advisors to both the US government as well as governments in the region. So I'm going to draw mainly from that, and I'm glad there are a couple of professors here to keep me honest and pose questions that would be germane to your courses and the knowledge that you're trying to gain through those classes. When Dr. Kim asked me for the title of my talk, I thought I would start with geoeconomics and geopolitics. First of all, because she's a geographer, so I figured she would like that. And second, because in the industry that I have worked in for now 40 years, the oil and gas industry, people tend to talk about geology. That's the geo part that people talk about mainly. But I'm going to make the argument that at least in this part of the world, geography is as much destiny as geology is. I'm going to try to weave some of the wealth and poverty themes into this talk, but you will help me do that, I'm sure, in questions that you might pose. So I've got too many slides. This is the problem of having an oil and gas industry speaker, is that we're sometimes rendered speechless without PowerPoint slides. But I'm not going to read them, which is kind of a disadvantage for the audience on the webcast. But I think the slides themselves will be posted along with the webcast announcement so that they can look at them at the same time. Okay, geography. So 2 points that I want to make. So Central Asia, most people's definition of Central Asia is about here: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, the 5 stands, and maybe sometimes people include the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia into that equation. But 2 points here. One is that if you look at it, we tended to think of that part of the world as the Soviet Union. But you would look at it from a geographic context without the political history, it is as much part of the greater Middle East or South Asia in some people's minds. So if you're from New Delhi, you would tend to think of it as your part of the world as well, and not just as, again, as a political legacy, the former Soviet Union. The other point that needs to be made is that it's landlocked. It has no access to the sea. The oil and gas industry likes access to the sea because if you can produce the oil or gas and get it in a tanker, then the world's your oyster. You can ship it all around the world economically. But if you're far away from either large consuming areas or from the sea, then you've got a disadvantage that can only be solved with economic pipeline projects. And this is part of the challenge. This is the geography part of geoeconomics, has a lot to do with the distance from market and no access to the sea. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was one of the first countries, if not the first countries in almost all cases, to recognize the former republics. This is my personal list of US national interests. This is not State Department sanctioned, but this is the way I saw it. That if the political independence of these republics are something that serves US interests, then their economic autonomy is really important because they were all dependent on Russia economically. And all their infrastructure was tied to Russia and not to the rest of the world. So if they are going to be politically independent, they need some economic independence, although they will continue to trade with Russia, some economic independence from Russia as well. Otherwise, they won't remain independent for a very long time, or they'll still always be Russia's backyard or someone else's backyard. And one of the few economic assets that they have to trade was oil and gas. So it was very clear that when a company like the one that I was working for at the time, Chevron, first entered this part of the world as an exciting new oil and gas province that they can operate in, that US and American commercial interests overlapped at that time. The United States was the largest oil importer in the world. It looked like we were this is now in the 90s, and it looked like we were going to start importing increasing amounts of natural gas. And as the largest importer in the world, incremental supply anywhere around the globe serves US national interests. Whether that oil and gas supply comes to US shores or not didn't really matter because it added to global supply, it added to global market liquidity, and that was good for us. Now I'm going to return to that because we're in a different energy posture today than we were in the 1990s, and we thought we were going to be there forever, right? So after 9/11, I added a couple other things. Now, what in Washington we call AFPAC, how to connect the countries in Central Asia to the uncertainties in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and how to connect Central Asia to South Asia became an interest in US policy as well. This was around the time that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, started talking about the new Silk Road, for example. And then a much lower category in my own mind is US commercial interests. You know, everything else being equal, we support our American companies' investments abroad. You know, we would like ExxonMobil or Chevron to do well, but to me, they don't rank to the same level of national policy interests as the first two that I mentioned. And then down the road again, in terms of priority, I would say oil and gas applies to other US trading partners and allies like Europe, for example. You know, everything else being equal, we like Europe to have diversified oil and gas supplies, not so dependent on Russia, and this part of the world may be able to serve that purpose. But again, not as paramount as we want these countries to stay independent, and that incremental supply of oil and gas to the global market is always good for the United States. Just quick some numbers for you to look at. Any geology students here? No geology students on the talk on oil and gas. I have a meeting with the geology professor Thursday morning. I have to talk to him about that. So the only column a geology student would know that I have to explain is the last column, which is reserve production ratio, which is you divide current annual production into what is known as the economic reserve base. You get a sense of the reserve life that's left. But it's a relative number, right? It's not an absolute number because reserves change, production change, technology change, commodity prices change. That's a moving ratio. But if you give you an idea of how much in reserves Russia has, for example, what their production is and what the reserve life that's estimated based on what we know today. Russia clearly is one of the major oil producers, oftentimes the second and third, sometimes the largest oil producer in the world. Its reserve production ratio is not particularly healthy. World average would be about 50, okay? So if you're an OPEC country, the OPEC average would be 85, 90. So even though they produce a lot of oil, the reserve base doesn't look as healthy as you might expect. But I've also got Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan in there. I stuck Iran at the bottom to give you a benchmark to judge from. But also we often forget that Iran is a literal state of the Caspian, that it is also part of the region as well. And as an OPEC country, you would expect its reserve production ratio to be much healthier. And generally speaking, higher than the global average. That was the picture for oil. This is the picture for gas. So you will notice that Russia's reserve production ratio for gas is much healthier than it was for oil. Again, Iran is kind of off the chart because of its reserve base. But notice Turkmenistan, right? Turkmenistan, if you could recall from the map, which we can go back to, is about as landlocked as you can get. But it's got the fourth largest gas reserves in the world, and therefore a very interesting country from a gas point of view, not so much for oil. But it gives you this, a sense of the reserves and resource base that we're talking about. Quick point, these are the Russian oil and gas provinces. Just one point I want to make is that distances are vast. I mean, even if you consider getting West Siberian gas to Moscow, distances are large, never mind getting it to Germany, right? So pipelines and pipeline politics, or pipeline policy, pipeline investments are critical to the survival of the oil and gas industry in this part of the world. And we will talk a little bit more later about Russian oil and gas to China. But generally speaking, the distance to China would be 3 times longer than the distance to Europe. So again, pipeline economics becomes really important. But it may be key to the development in East Siberia more than the traditional producing areas in Western Siberia. So big distances. These are some of what I consider to be the fundamentals of the oil and gas industry. Risks are inherent in the business. If you don't like risks, get out of the business. Companies that are not very good at managing risks, for the sake of argument, Japanese companies are terrible at managing risks and have invested tens of billions of dollars of Japanese taxpayers' money without much result to show for it. It's really about, it's like, going to the casino. If you don't place any bets, you're not going to win. So it's about managing your money. Half the time you're wrong when you drill. If you're lucky, half the time you're wrong. So you have to drill enough to have successes, right? So you have geologic risks. Even if you find the stuff, there may be technical risks that can't be overcome on extracting that oil and gas resources. Of course, you have commodity price risks. It's a cyclical business. It's a cyclical business for very fundamental economic reasons. For example, neither supply and demand are very elastic in the short to medium term. It's capital intensive with high barriers to entry, long lead times, things take a long time to happen. So they tend to be long cycles. And oil and gas clearly is not the only commodity business that has long cycles. This is a picture of 155 years of oil price history. The dark lines are in money of the day, and the light lines are inflation-adjusted prices. So you can see that this is an industry that goes through cycle. The last big one before the current one that people remember is the 1970s, the 2 oil price shocks. Arab oil embargo in 73, Iranian revolution 78, 79, leading to a big spike in oil prices, but then it dropped down again. And then we had 15 years of relatively low oil and gas prices from the mid-1980s until the late 1990s, maybe even 2000. And then we had the rise in the 2000s in oil prices. Today's price, and this is how obsessed I am, is about $58. So we're looking at somewhere around here right now. Now, will these cycles repeat? Will we have another 15-year relatively moderate price? Or will everything be shorter because that was so last century, and in the 21st century, everything moved faster? How does the shale revolution in the United States impact the length of the price cycles? So, we will find out, right? This is a chart of the prices since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union collapsed at a time of relatively weak oil prices. There are academic writings that maybe the Soviet Union collapsed because of low oil prices. It's kind of, or is it just a coincidence in timing? But the reasons are much deeper than that. But you see that this is the period, and about 2000, Actually, New Year's Day 2000, we learned that Vladimir Putin was going to be president of Russia. And then oil prices kind of started rising for most of his first time as president for 8 years. And then it dropped, and then it rose again. So this is the more recent period that we're looking at. It's hard to explain high oil prices between 2011 to 2014 based on fundamental supply and demand. It's more likely to be political uncertainty, the Arab Spring, and other uncertainties triggering a change in market sentiment, which lasted 3.5 years, quite a long period of time. A lot of us said during this time that $100 oil cannot last. But then we were wrong for 3.5 years, right? So, and then in July of 2014, it started dropping. Somewhat coincident to Western sanctions against Russia as a result of the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014, as well as the hostilities in the Donbass region supported by Russia that started in Ukraine during that period of time. Pipelines. Russia, oil and gas, you can't get to market without pipelines. This is some of the projects, but the two most topical ones that people are talking about right now is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project going under the Baltic Sea from Russia directly to markets in Germany and beyond without going through the traditional area of transit, which is and was Ukraine, as well as the Turkish Stream pipeline, which takes gas directly from Russia to the European portion of Turkey. Those are the two projects that people talk about the most. This is a picture from spring of this year of the laid barge that's going to lay the pipe under the Black Sea, entering the Bosphorus. You can see the scale of the thing, right? I mean, it's bigger than an aircraft carrier. And so these are multi-billion-dollar projects, sometimes maybe $10 billion projects. So these are projects that are not something that you can turn around quickly. It takes a long time to put the project together. It takes a long time to build, and there are all kinds of uncertainties along the way. So this is very recent, this spring. So some of the political drivers of petroleum policy, in my mind, at least in this part of the world, is that control is paramount. Oil and gas economies tend to favor centralization of power, tend to favor centralization of political decision-making as well as economic control. And therefore, they are favorites of authoritarian regimes around the world because you don't have to tax your population to raise revenue. In fact, you have revenue generated, vast revenue sometimes, generated from oil and gas with which you can use to buy off your population. You know, spread favors and build political support that way. There are clearly other drivers as well. The last bullet is just a polite way of saying corruption. And that's what that's about. And we know, and sometimes people talk about the resource curse as a shorthand way of representing some of the attributes of an oil and gas dominant economy. So one of the things that has happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union is that Russia has become a petrostate. The Soviet Union was not a petrostate. The Soviet Union, in fact, had limited trade in oil and gas with the rest of the world. But Russia has become a petrostate. 50% and up until the collapse in oil prices in July 2014, 50% of federal budget revenue came from oil and gas. oil and gas represented 70% of export earnings from Russia. But you can also see that it helped Vladimir Putin centralize power in Russia. As long as the price was rising, it was an easy ride. What happens when the price drops? That's an interesting question. One of the things you might do if you're under Western economic sanctions and you have much lower revenue because of oil and gas prices dropping is, for Russia, maybe you would turn to China as the partner in the future. By the way, I don't Photoshop these things. These are actual photographs. And the last one was an actual Economist cover. But you know, it does look kind of Star Trek-y. But I didn't come up with the caption either. The Moscow Times did. Now, there are lots of compelling reasons why strategically building an oil and gas relationship is important to both sides. China is now the world's largest oil importer. It wants to diversify its supply source. Russia, being a large oil and gas exporter, is heavily dependent on the European market. And so it may want to diversify its export markets. But there are certain uncertainties and mechanisms that and agreements to be arrived at in order for some of these mega projects to go forward. But it does satisfy elite requirements from both sides, I would contend. So even though the economics are difficult, I don't discount the fact that Russia and China will try to make this growing oil and gas relationship work. And there are many things happening in the news just in the last couple of weeks that it would indicate that they're doing that. Among China's objectives, for example, may be to lessen the dependence on maritime imports of oil and gas. Something like 80% of China's oil and gas imports come by sea, and therefore they are vulnerable to the interdiction by someone else's navy. If you have to go through the Straits of Malacca, you have to go through the South China Sea to get your oil and gas imports. So if a little bit of balance of pipeline oil and gas imports from either Russia or Central Asia would be a good thing, everything else being equal, if you can make the economics work. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the shorthand is they're worried about the Seventh Fleet. Okay? And if you were a central military planner in China, for example, that would be something that you need to be concerned about or aware of. So that's one of the many drivers of why this relationship may build over time. The problem is that Russia is weaker and weaker all the time. So every time Xi Jinping shakes hands with Vladimir Putin, and they do that 3-4 times a year now, the Russian economy is a little bit smaller. So from China's point of view, time's on their side. No reason to rush into a bad deal. You never say no to the Russians because there's no percentage in saying no to the Russians. You just never say a final yes. And the money doesn't flow as quickly, certainly, as the Russians would like to see Chinese money either in terms of loans or equity investments grow in China, because time's on China's side, particularly in a relatively soft oil and gas market globally right now. So Russia says, let's go do something else. Let's go to India. This is the most fantastic pipeline project I've ever heard of. So I really like it because it gives me a nice acronym, the Russia-India pipeline, RIP. Because if you think about the distance of getting, say, West Siberian oil and gas to India, not just in terms of horizontal distance, but the number of mountain ranges and never mind political borders, you have to cross. This is fantasy. It's never going to happen. But it illustrates Russia's need to show China that you're not the only game in town, that they will go elsewhere if the Chinese don't come to terms. And in a certain extent, Prime Minister Modi is happy to pretend along with the Russians. There are lots of issues for the Russian industry at a time of soft prices, mainly having to do with how do you maintain or increase investments so you can continue to produce the volumes that you need to support your economy. Dependence on the European market continues to be a challenge from an industry point of view. What if Europe, for either reasons of anti-Russia because of aggression in Ukraine or because of climate change policies, decide that they don't want to import as much oil and gas from Russia anymore? What would Russia's alternatives be? And they've got to look elsewhere. But there are also major issues having to do with Western economic sanctions by both the US and the EU against Russia that is somewhat targeted to oil and gas industry, at least in the medium to long term, not necessarily short-term supply. Its relationship with OPEC. But the last one is really, how do you have economic growth in a heavily oil and gas dependent economy when oil and gas prices are not going to grow and your volumes are not going to grow? Is it not time for real economic reform to diversify the Russian economy away from oil and gas? And of course, the income disparity problem is a common problem in natural gas resource countries, where the wealth goes to the very few who are politically powerful or have political access to for their businesses, but the general population is getting poorer and poorer, which is exactly what's happening in Russia right now. For the other Central Asian countries or other countries in Eurasia, you have similar problems, but you have maybe additional problems. They're not going to change their geography. They're more landlocked than Russia. If you think of Russia as being landlocked, they're even more landlocked. And they have issues being newly independent countries of political stability, no experience with political secession to speak of. In a country like Kazakhstan, the general secretary of the Kazakhstan Communist Party has been president since independence, and he is still president 25 years later. So you don't have a political system that have gone through secession. But economic growth and diversification of the economy are also problems. Reform may be even harder in this part of the world, and certainly distribution of income remains an issue. Ambivalent attitude towards China's growing role in the region. Remember, all these leaders are Soviet-educated people who were taught from grade school to be afraid of invasion from the East. The only successful invasions of Russia were from the East, not from the West. That's still somewhat ingrained. So although you like Chinese investments, you like Chinese access to Chinese markets, there's 1.3, 1.4 billion people on one side, and you are in a sparsely populated country, relatively speaking. How much Chinese investment, how much Chinese involvement in your economy can you afford? What is the role of organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and others? So the problem of the resource curse, shorthand, of course, is not exclusive to this part of the world. it's somewhat universal, and there's a lot of academic writing about this. For me, as a practitioner, it's really not, it's not the resource that occurs, is maybe the resource impeding the establishment of sound governance. That's the problem basically behind it. So we got Venezuela right now imploding in front of us, but not limited, right? Nigeria, Angola, Libya. I mean, so part of my contention of why oil prices are as high as they are, rather than at $40, is that there's a whole slew of political uncertainty out there, including the biggest one of them all, which is what happens to the future of Saudi Arabia as you have political succession to the third generation coming up of Saudi kings. How stable is Saudi Arabia, which is basically the country with the largest reserves and the cheapest oil to produce in the world? There's a lot of uncertainty there. So I don't want to give you the idea that the problems of resource curse or lack of proper governance is limited to this part of the world, is somewhat universal, but it includes this part of the world. Where's US policy in all of this? Remember I said in the 1990s we were worried about resource scarcity. We thought the world was running out of oil and gas. Now, 2/3 of our oil and gas production come from shale, which is a revolution that's only 5-10 years old, depending on whether you're talking about oil or talking about gas. And where's our policy really? Do we have a policy on this part of the world? I would submit not. I'm from Washington. I live in Washington. Or do we have just a bunch of slogans? Hillary Clinton's New Silk Road. What are the budget dollars in the New Silk Road? In Washington, we judge whether there's a real policy or not by whether there's any money behind it. And there's no money behind the New Silk Road. So what kind of policy has no money behind it? Obama's pivot to Asia, or as Kirk Campbell, Assistant Secretary for Asia Pacific in the State Department, said, the rebalance to Asia. What was that about? Was that just another slogan? The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a real policy under Obama, poorly executed, but a real policy. Came too late in his political term to have any chance of being approved by Congress. You ended up with the two candidates from both major parties campaigning against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, it may have, the intention may have been there, but what is, the policy execution was certainly lacking. This administration, the current administration, likes to talk about energy dominance. No one in Washington can figure out what that means. But Trump and Rick Perry, the Secretary of Energy, talks constantly about energy dominance. Is this going to be the beginning of a new policy? Maybe too early to tell, to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not going to wait a whole lot longer. Okay. What is our response to other countries' policies in the region, whether it's Russia's Eurasian Economic Union or China's One Belt, One Road? Kind of muddled in Washington, I would say. And that is reflected in things like our attitude towards the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which the Chinese built a year or two ago, and we discouraged our allies from joining it, particularly our European allies, and they all joined it anyway. As a reflection that America really doesn't have a policy for this part of the world. Do we need a policy for this part of the world? It's so far away, we don't really need their oil and gas anymore because we're approaching energy self-sufficiency. Certainly in North America, we have energy self-sufficiency if you add Canada and Mexico to the equation. Western Hemisphere, you add Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, so on, you're even better off. Maybe we're better off making sure that the Argentines have shale production down the road. No, Japan and Europe's energy import needs, which will remain, should we care about that? Maybe they should worry about that, right? It's their energy security, not ours. Of course, they have no ability to have a policy without us. These are subjects that needs to be debated in Washington, but I would submit to you have not been done, at least not done very well. And given the policy climate in Washington right this moment, it's unlikely to be debated in any real way anytime soon as well. So with that, I'm going to end. I've got one more slide on American shale revolution and why it happened in the United States and not somewhere else. But I think we're coming close to the time that Dr. Kim has allotted for us. So I'd be happy to answer any of your questions from this point on. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And any questions?
So I'm not so familiar with the energy policies of other countries. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on China's One Belt, One Road policy and what the main focus of that policy is.
So the idea of the One Belt, One Road policy is to invest in infrastructure in this broad continent that will lead to more trade of goods and services, including but not exclusive to energy. I think the case of why China is interested in energy infrastructure is clear from the presentation, but it's not limited to energy. It's unproven whether it makes any sense or not. You would have to repeal the Maritime Revolution. Henry the Navigator of Portugal all the way back. There's a lot of advantages to maritime transport of goods and services, of goods rather. For one thing, you can do backhauls. You can do triangular trade, right? Particularly with containers. Your ships don't have to run empty. You build a railroad. The other end has to have something to, transport back to you. Otherwise, it's one-way traffic. What are all those containers going to just get piled up at the other end? It's not so, and it's not very flexible, right? In oil and gas, which is what I know, you can have a cargo coming from a producing area, going to a consuming area. If it's a seaborne cargo, you can trade it half a dozen times while it's on the journey. And it gives you lots of flexibility. If the price today is higher in Yokohama than Shanghai, you sell to Yokohama. That's the way the modern oil and gas business is done right now. You can't do that with a pipeline. First of all, you don't have a pipeline to Yokohama, right? You have to build a very expensive pipeline from Russia to China. But this is what China claims to be doing. Now, for me, this is more than just an economic policy. That this is as much a political policy. And it has to do with the economic side and the external economic side of what Xi Jinping calls China's dream, which is a domestic-oriented policy. But reestablishing China's place in the world after 150 years of humiliation under Western imperialism, that's what there are two sides of the same coin to me as external policy. Now what happens is that the Chinese industry games the government when they hear that. You got free money to spend. I'd be happy to build you a high-speed rail from Samara to Moscow. Whether a high-speed rail from Samara to Moscow make any sense or not, no one knows, right? Including, like, why would you take a train from Samara to Moscow? Why wouldn't you just fly? It would be a lot more efficient, both in terms of cost and time. So a lot of these projects may not make any sense when you're spending other people's money. But if you have surplus industrial capacity, and China has surplus industrial capacity in steel, in cement, in glass, in lots of different things, and I've got surplus labor that's looking for work, and I can send them to build a port in Pakistan. Whether that port in Pakistan makes any sense or not, whether anyone knows how to invest $55 billion in Pakistan properly with an economic return or not, you know, if the Chinese would be discovering something that we haven't learned for decades on how to invest in the Pakistan economy, yet to be proven. But that's one belt, one road to me. But it's a big slogan, you know, and you have a very ambitious leader in Xi Jinping, and when he has a big slogan, everyone supports him, and then you game it by trying to get government subsidized financing funds to do projects. It may turn out to be a colossal failure, but the difference is that they have a real policy. It's got $1 trillion behind it. $1 trillion behind it. China has more than $3 trillion in foreign currency reserves. So when they have a policy, even if it's, in my mind, maybe not the best policy, they can actually get things done because there's real money behind it. When we talk about pivot to Asia, you know, it's 50 Marines in Darwin. There's no money behind these American slogans. So we have no policy. They have a policy that may or may not work, but they're willing to invest in. So that's the difference to me. But you can't listen to a speech by any Chinese leader today without One Belt, One Road being part of that slogan right now. Yes.
Kind of like how we can see like the transition into like sustainable energy. How do you see that like affecting like oil and gas companies? Because I know you were showing like a couple graphs before, and there was like a major like decline towards now. How big of a factor do you see that into that decline, and like how do you see it like affecting those companies?
So, more than 5 years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago, people in the industry used to talk about peak oil. Maybe we're running out of the geology to continually increasing the production of oil and gas. Now people talk about peak demand, which may be just as wrong as peak oil, but that's another story. That may be because of climate and policy and other reasons, demand will plateau and start declining. And so part of the story is renewables. And the renewables, particularly wind and solar, become cheaper and cheaper, more and more economic. Still requires some subsidies from government. And one of the reasons the renewable industry is quite healthy right now is that in the budget resolution at the end of 2015, we gave the wind and solar industry 5-year tax credits rather than having to have it then renewed every year. So that gave certainty of investment conditions to a certain extent. So we're seeing renewable costs coming down. I'm a technology optimist, so I tend to think that that innovation will bring us cleaner and cheaper energy. That's been the history. We went from wood to coal because coal was more efficient, cheaper. Kind of hard to run the steam engine with wood, and the industrial revolution was driven by coal. We moved from coal to oil because oil was cheap, became more economic, but also cleaner than coal. And we've moved to gas, and which is cleaner than oil. So these things are happening. One of the things that is hard to discern right now is what happens to oil's unique advantages as a transportation fuel. You know, are you all going to drive electric cars? And if you're going to drive electric cars, what fuel generates the electricity to begin with? If you're in China and 60% of electricity or higher is generated by coal, then you're driving a coal car. If you're driving an electric car in China. If you're in the United States, you're more likely to be driving a car that's fueled by natural gas or renewables. So it depends on what the, but there are certain unique qualities of gasoline or liquid fuels, when you include jet fuel, that is hard to replace right now for transportation fuel. But we're starting to do some things that's kind of interesting. Long-haul trucking using liquefied natural gas as the fuel, for example, because we have plentiful gas and cheap gas in the United States right now. So some of these things are happening. I'm inclined to believe that the way we organize our lives are going to change. So I have an office in downtown Washington, but I live an hour away. I don't go to the office every day. You know, I go to the office once or twice a week, basically to see people in DC. The rest of the time, I'm sitting in my home office. What I need is mobility, right? What I need is ability to communicate with people. But Skype gives me mobility. I can talk to people all around the world without flying there every week. And I know the internet, the IT revolution, all of a sudden, I mean, I've got apps I don't know how to use, right? You know, WeChat and, and WhatsApp and whatever, and people are making phone calls to me. I got a phone call from Ukraine on WhatsApp the other day. I didn't even know WhatsApp can do a voice call, but someone told me to download it, so I did. And I didn't even know how to answer it, but I do now, right? So what people crave is not to drive in a car necessarily to get mobility, but they want the sense of mobility, right? That's what we want. And there are other ways of doing it without going into the central city to go to an office every day of the week. Your lives are organized very differently than when I was a young person, and that will continue to change. Who says you need a car? Maybe you can do car sharing. Maybe you can do Uber. Young people are moving back into the city center. There are all kinds of social things in terms of people's work habits and how they want to live. That's changing. Who says that everyone wants to have a large house in the suburbs? Maybe that's all going to change. And so the unique role that oil has in transportation fuel may also change over time. We'll probably still use a certain amount of oil. We need it for petrochemicals, for example. It's hard to replace oil and gas feedstock in petrochemical. But there's nothing that says that it always has to be the dominant fuel in everything else. So I think it's going to change, and I think it's going to be cleaner and cheaper. At least that's the history of innovation in this industry. Gentleman here.
Okay. I'm from sociology. We met before.
Yes.
Have been lunch together last year. I think we started together.
Right.
When you came last year,
in Salam. I've always get taken to Salam.
Good memory about that.
Yeah.
Okay, my question regarding this energy politics, you talk about a lot of Russia, China, and this Middle East. But I would like to know your thoughts on the South China Sea conflict. Do you think that this China, this demand for this control and some kind of with Philippines, Malaysia, and especially with Vietnam, and so Do you think this conflict revolving around the oil underneath the sea or something else? You know, it's like in terms of
I'm very convinced it's about something else.
Okay.
So oil and gas production generally doesn't happen in the middle of an ocean because they come from sedentary basins, basically. There are exceptions, but not so far from the coast. The oil and gas resources in the South China Sea, in the disputed part of the South China Sea, is unknown. There are all kinds of estimates, but they're estimates. No one has actually drilled enough to know for sure.
What about Vietnam? It seems like Vietnam did drill, you know, and got
Yeah.
a lot of oil, and then that's
Well, what's a lot, right? So I think that Hillary Clinton was absolutely wrong when she said in a speech at Georgetown University on the creation of the Energy Bureau and the State Department that the South China Sea dispute is all about oil and gas. I don't think it's all about oil and gas. Oil and gas may be a small part of it. I'm not saying that it's not at all about oil and gas, but it's not the main reason. The main reason to me has to do with sovereignty, has to do with freedom of navigation, even having to do with fishery more than it does with oil and gas. Fishery is a real domestic political issue for Vietnam, Philippines, also for China.
and also with Japan. Yeah.
Also in the East China Sea.
Yeah.
So it's more about that and oil and gas resources. China imports today 8 million barrels per day, thereabouts. No one thinks that anyone's going to find 8 million barrels per day in the South China Sea. But access to the South China Sea, really important. I think in foreign policy terms, it's also about diminishing America's military dominance of the Western Pacific, right? And you know, if you're China, why would you want a power so far away to dominate your shores, right? So the idea of pushing America farther away is certainly a part of it in the foreign security policy terms. But so there are a lot of issues, but it's not. But oil and gas is sexy. So newspapers love oil and gas, right? Because they're always talking about billions of dollars, unproven. So there's a lot of ink about oil and gas, but I don't believe that that's the central reason. There are much more important reasons, in my mind, in the South China Sea dispute, having to do with sovereignty
Yes, you're right. The navigation, this oil route, you know, from Malacca
Right.
Strait, you know,
Right.
that's the part. You know, the United States of China trying to control
Right.
this road.
It's not necessarily a rational policy, in my mind, because a naval embargo is actually an act of war. So if the Seventh Fleet were really going to block oil tankers from the Persian Gulf to go to China, that's an act of war already, okay? So you can't really do that, you know, very easily. And how do you know where the tanker's going anyway? You have to go, you know, you have to board it, you have to do all kinds of things that you wouldn't want to do ordinarily. So I think the Chinese fear is somewhat irrational, but I think it's understandable though. If you were in their position, if someone else's navy were patrolling the Caribbean, we would be concerned. Off the west coast of the United States, we would be concerned, and we would want to push them farther away. So I think it's understandable, but it has to do with a lot of other issues that are more important substantively and also symbolically.
This is your view. Answer is very insightful. Yeah, I just one
Okay,
more.
so-
Yeah. Quick. So the Philippines was very
Under the previous president.
Yeah. And the previous president was kind of in a very
Right.
confrontational position with China. But later, now, Philippines seem like in a good relation with China. What caused that relation change? You know, is it like change the president or something else?
Well, it was very hard for President Aquino, given the position that he had already taken, to back down. So I go to China once or twice a year. I tell them that as long as you have the same president, you're not going to be you can offer to him all the money in the world, he can't back down politically. But so you have a new president, a rather bizarre new president. But you know, who are we to talk nowadays? And so China has offered a lot of money to make this policy go away. Interesting is that China has basically conceded now that a common, I'm forgetting the technical term, a common code of behavior in the South China Sea will be negotiated with ASEAN countries. Previously, China was never willing to negotiate with ASEAN as a group. They wanted bilateral negotiations. So I think that China's also moderated position a little bit. I'm happy to remain and answer student questions if there are more.
We've had a few questions on China, so let's have some questions on Central Asia or environmental issues. How about
Central Asia, kind of.
Okay, you too, go.
Thanks for the presentation. It was so informative for me, especially when I'm coming from Afghanistan, so we have things around. And regarding this gas pipeline, we have a project called TAPI. Yeah, and it comes from Turkmenistan with the intent to go to India.
Right.
So I was wondering that maybe how economically possible it can be to implement that project.
It's a very tough project.
Yeah,
I'll tell you because I advised the Pentagon when they were working on that project, hoping to get the Turkmen to concede on certain terms so that oil companies would want to invest in that project. And the Turkmen refused, basically. It was an economically challenging project. TAPI, for those of you who don't know, would be a major gas pipeline that goes from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, Pakistan to India. Therefore TAPI. So when the price of the commodity is now half of what it used to be, the economics are really impossible right now. It's a project that's been along for a very long time. I mean, even during Taliban days. It would require some relaxation by the Turkmen government on allowing foreign investment in the upstream, what we call the upstream, which is the oil and gas producing end of the business, because oil companies don't invest in pipelines for the sake of pipeline, making profits on pipelines. They want to be producing oil and gas from which they will derive an equity rate of return. So that's not the business they're in. And the Turkmen government doesn't have a lot of money right now. But it's such a political project that no one will give up on it. So the Asian Development Bank continues to work on it. I went to Manila half a dozen times. But it doesn't have very good prospects immediately. Doesn't mean the medium to long term doesn't make sense. Turkmenistan wants to diversify away from China, which is their major buyer of gas right now. Used to be Russia, it's now China. And India is a market. The Indians want integration with Central Asia. So if it were economically possible to move the gas from Turkmenistan to India, it would be a very good project, but probably more medium to long term. But you will continue to read news about it, because political projects never die. They don't even fade away.
You and okay, you go.
So you put up some figures about the how much oil and gas accounts for government revenue of Russia, and how much it accounts for exports from Russia.
Right.
And it's clear that there's definitely a dependence on that industry in the state. You call it a petro-state. From what I've read about the resource curse, a lack of economic diversity is one form of poor governance that leads to that curse. And so I'm curious if Russia has made any efforts to grow other industries to address that issue.
So Russia has done certain things. So it's not, they created a rainy day fund. They created a sovereign wealth fund to protect against the inevitable, to me, downturn in oil prices when they are too high. But the problem is that they invest those extra dollars in the right things. If you invest them in control of the oil industry, which is more or less what Vladimir Putin did with a national champion company called Rosneft, that may, and oil prices come down, maybe that doesn't give you the right economic rate of return. And investing in the right things may not be the things that people think are sexy. Investing in education, investing in healthcare, investing in roads and other infrastructure. Maybe in the long run, that gives you a better rate of return and helps the rest of your economy diversify in a way that doubling down on oil and gas doesn't actually help you. It just makes your situation worse when the inevitable downturn happens. That's more or less, I'm simplifying a little bit, what the Russians have done. So it's not right to say they've done nothing. They particularly, a lot of those things were put together under the previous finance minister, Kudrin, but he hasn't been in office for a long time. So now they're kind of in a fix. They have maintained macroeconomic policies pretty well. So they devalued the ruble like crazy. So if you devalue your local currency and your oil and gas production costs are based on local currency, and your earnings are based in dollars, you can keep doing this for a long time. So the oil and gas economy is fine, but the rest of it is not so good, and the rest of it needs to grow. The Soviet Union used to have a pretty good education system, and that's now collapsing also because of underinvestment. So, but that's a typical resource curse problem. So there's a question back there?
Thank you. In your opinion, do you think the transition to like a cleaner, renewable energy in Eurasia, do you think it's taking longer more because of just there needs to be more technological innovation to make it cleaner, or do you think it has more to do with like the authoritarian regimes in some areas trying to keep like a political stronghold?
Well, I'm going to give you a third answer. How about that? You have to price the commodity correctly. So if you want to encourage renewables, then you have to, you can't subsidize oil and gas consumption, for example, the most extreme case. And a lot of oil and gas economies subsidize domestic consumption, right? So you've got a weak political legitimacy to begin with, and you live in a cold place. I think I deserve to have enough gas to heat my home, right? That's the least you can do for me. So you buy people off with those kinds of social transfer payments, but it doesn't help you grow a solar or wind industry when you have to, then the renewables has to compete against a cheaper source called oil and gas that's subsidized. So you need to get the pricing right to encourage investment in renewables. To the extent you worry about externalities of using oil and gas, economic term that the professors will explain to you because I can hardly explain it myself, then you might want to tax the thing, right? So if you worry about climate, if you're worried about national security, let's say, you could tax something that you want to diminish and subsidize something you want to grow. That's what you would do. In Western economies, we often talk about a carbon tax as a way of accounting for the externality of what some people would say overuse of oil and gas, right? So if you don't tax emissions, then how are you going to get the right behavior? In the United States, the best example is the gasoline tax, right? We haven't increased the gasoline tax since the first year of the Bill Clinton administration. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is going bankrupt, and we haven't, so a tax on energy consumption, in this case of gasoline, would lead to the kind of behavior that you might want, but politicians are too chicken to do that, right? Because they want to get elected the next year. This is the reason why I'll never be elected to anything. So there are things that you could do to encourage, and that's very hard to do in an oil and gas country. An oil and gas country, now Saudi Arabia is talking about renewables. I mean, you say, well, Saudi Arabia must have a lot of solar potential. But you can't do it if you subsidize electricity, right? So there are certain policies you need to get correct. And most of all, to me, as a kind of a market economy guy, is to get the pricing signal correct, to encourage and the right kind of behavior and discourage what you don't want to see grow.
That was really great to hear from an industry expert. Any final question?
Yeah, there's the gentleman back there.
Okay, go ahead.
Real quick, so I'm a student in international development, and you touched on the resource curse that kind of Paul Collier really touches on a lot. And you also mentioned conflict traps, and you mentioned being landlocked earlier. But you kind of are describing all of that coming back to bad governance and poor governance. So in terms of developing countries that may be landlocked or have this resource curse, such as now Algeria or Venezuela, where does that governance come from? That I know we have to establish institutions. Is that a mandate of the people? Is that on the international entities, the transnational entities, or is it just something that comes from an economic boom first, and then the government's able to build on that? Where can it all really? Where does the government able to really come from?
That's a really good question, and you should study it and write the definitive paper on it, because I don't have a good answer for you. The examples that people give are unsatisfactory. For example, people say Norway. Well, Norway was a democratic, rule-based country before the discovery of oil in the Norwegian section of the North Sea. So, you can't say, well, Mozambique should look like Norway, because Mozambique doesn't look a thing like Norway, right? So, and the countries that you talk about, Venezuela and Algeria, that kind of bad political system and bad political actors, in a way, are already entrenched. So if you're the World Bank and other international financial institutions, you tend to look at the countries have newly acquired resource wealth, like a Mozambique, and say, what are the policies that you need to put in place in order for you not to suffer the resource curse? But it's very difficult to do when you don't have a basis for it to begin with. The example I like to give, because I don't like to preach when I'm overseas, because there are enough Americans who preach when they go overseas, is I use domestic US examples. What's the difference between California and Texas, which were both oil and gas producing states, and Louisiana? No. Texas and California have diversified economies. They were oil and gas once dominant, but they seem to have invested in the right things, including building a state university system. Both states, the state university system was basically built on the back of oil and gas money. Louisiana hasn't changed in spite of having oil and gas, right? It's still one of the most corrupt states in the union. If you look at life expectancy, literacy, income, they're just as bad. So is it because of oil and gas that destroyed them, or is it because of poor governance? And just because you have oil and gas doesn't mean that you are always damned to a resource curse either. Look at Alabama. Alabama doesn't have any oil and gas, and they're just as bad off as Louisiana, right? So it doesn't explain everything. But to me, it has something to do with how do you capture the wealth coming out of the earth and invest it in the right things long term, so for your economy and your people. And it has to do with a lot of, as I say, not that, you don't build, bridges and airports and things like that. It's kind of small ball, making sure that your education system is up to snuff, making sure that people have access to health care, making sure that there are roads and other transport infrastructure, but that's what needs to be done if you want a broadly diversified economy. Otherwise, you're no better off the day all your oil and gas is depleted than you were before. And that's a shame. So thank you very much for all your attention.